I've recommended over 15 books on this channel so far, all to do with inner healing and to be able to guide the process as you do that inner work. But I'm also very, very aware of the fact that a lot of people might not necessarily have time to actually read all these books, and that causes a problem in and of itself. So the question that I'm asking myself today is, if I had to summarize down my library into just 3 books that had the most impact, then what would they be? And these are 3 books that I've already recommended in this wider playlist, but I wanted to create a dedicated video just to explain why these 3 books, when combined together, will have the most impact out of all of the books that I've recommended. So the reason why I'm doing it in this way is, what we need to do when we are thinking about inner work is we need to understand who it is that we consciously are and who we consciously identify with. We also need to be able to understand what is going on underneath the surface. So that is our unconscious self, the things that are already pulling the strings, but we're just not aware of them. And then we need that bridge in the middle of how do we make these unconscious contents more conscious overall. So that's why these 3 books that I'm going to recommend are 3 that you've probably already seen if you've already been making your way through this playlist. But if not, on the unconscious side, I'm recommending Romancing the Shadow by Connie, Zweig and Steve Wolf. So this is going over the shadow material, if you're familiar with Jungian theory. So it's this idea of things that are a part of us, but we don't consciously identify with them. They still pull the strings behind the surface and they still influence our thoughts, our behaviors and our decisions, but we just aren't maybe quite aware of them. So on the unconscious side, that's where we're going to start. On the other side of that, we're going to have a look at Abraham Maslow's Toward a Psychology of Being, which provides a fantastic set of guidelines and principles and just rules to be able to follow if you want to become that self-actualized person, to be able to go on to self-transcendence if you want to take it that far as well. So the idea is, once we've been able to figure out some of this unconscious content of what is going on inside of us, how do we make it conscious in a healthy way to make it relevant in our life on an ongoing process? But life isn't that simple. We can't just figure something out and then all of a sudden just do it. We're not machines in that way. So we need to be able to bridge the gap. And that's where The Primal Wound by John Firman and Gila would come in, because this is going to be able to nicely bridge the gap between those 2 situations. So just to help make this relevant, I'll give you an example about how this might be useful, and then also show you just how it's been useful for me as well, because I've made notes on these books as I go along, so I can try to break it all down for you. So the idea being, let's say we start with Romancing the Shadow, and let's say we're starting with an issue around confidence. So let's say at work you're not feeling particularly confident, and yeah, that's the situation as it needs to be at this point in time. The issue is with confidence. Maybe at this point what we need to think about is, where does our lack of confidence come from? This might be the shadow work, the unconscious material that we're trying to deal with. What is it that our family was saying to us growing up? What were the messages that were being reinforced? Who did we look up to? And as a result, put ourselves in relation to when we think about them. What were our friends saying? What were the other authority figures saying as we were growing up? What was pushed out and cast aside because it didn't fit in with your specific context, your specific cultural backdrop, the time period that you happen to have been born into? What kind of traits were encouraged and discouraged? The ones that are discouraged are very much going to be the prime material for shadow work itself. So as a result of all this, what's going to happen is we've got this idea of, I am this type of person and I'm definitely not this type of person. But if we're struggling with confidence, to stick with the same example, then that could be a real issue. It might be that our family considered confidence to be the same as overconfidence, which is the same as arrogance. And as a result, because we don't want to be considered arrogant, then we also try to push down the inner confidence that we have in ourselves as well. So as a result, what we need to do is we need to try to think about it as, in the most healthy way, the most functional way, what is it that I need in my psychology to be able to integrate so that I can actually be confident in a healthy way? Not so that I'm arrogant, not so that I'm overconfident, but so that I can have a look at my childhood and think, actually, it would have been better if I was a little bit more confident. So what are some guidelines? What are some principles that I can follow? Because it's going to feel unnatural for me to suddenly become this confident person. Essentially what I'm doing is putting on this confident persona, which doesn't feel quite real at this point in time. But by using the guidelines and the principles and looking at the different values that I know healthy people have, healthy human subjects and specimens, as Abraham Maslow refers to them, I can then have a bit of a guidance, a bit of a plan to be able to go towards, as I've said multiple times in this playlist, a desired future. So I've figured out already, just from those 2 books, an area that I'm struggling with. Like, I've started to consider why I'm struggling with it. I've also started to consider now where I want to be in the future when I think about this. And when I think about it as well, just to make it really, really clear, I'm thinking about, if I had more confidence, what type of person would I be? How good would that be for me and for the people around me? How would this raise my self-esteem? How could I then go on to help other people and be of further service to the people that are around me and to myself? There's a lot of good reasons as to why I'd want to develop this confidence, but I've still got a few blocks around it at this point in time, which is where something like this would come in, the primal wound, where it starts to help us understand this idea of a unifying center. Why it might be that we need somebody else in the first place to be able to accept that trait in us, maybe at a distance, and then over time we can start to bring that trait in closer and closer to us. So if, let's say, you've got a particularly trusted friend and you want to be able to talk through this idea of developing confidence with them, it might be that you don't feel like you could become that type of person, but that other person sees you in your best moments and thinks, oh yeah, that would be really good. Let me help you on that journey. Or at least talk it through with me as we're able to process something like this. And then as it becomes more and more normalized, as you start to talk about it more and more to this other person originally, so they become what's referred to as an external unifying center. External as in outside of you, unifying center in the sense of, rather than pushing away this idea of confidence somewhere out of your mind, you're actually being able to look at it here. Maybe you just be peeking at it at the start. It might be that actually it's just in the peripheral vision at this point, but over time we can learn to look at it. And instead of then making it purely external, we can then learn over time to make it internal. So rather than having to use that friend to be able to give us that little self-esteem boost to be able to become more confident, we can slowly learn, oh, actually, this can become an internal unifying center. This can be something which I can then realize in a healthy way that I want to become, and I can put in support within myself so that I can manage this process. So all of that, just to talk you through that idea of confidence, starts with the shadow work, starts with the unconscious material. We then think about it in the desired future. Where is it that we're trying to aim towards? So we've got a point A and we've got a point B. And then this is helping us to bridge that journey and that gap in understanding that we are worthy of this. And actually, when we start to look at how to actually accept some of these different traits, which might seem a little bit alien to us to begin with, it helps us to be able to map that journey and that progress overall. It can be really, really difficult to accept that. And that's why when we're looking at this, this is using something called psychosynthesis. I could easily describe all of this as how do we make our higher unconscious more relevant to our life. So when we think about ourselves in the best possible way, how do we bring that down to make it actually relevant and practical in our lives? But equally, on the lower unconscious side, how do we bring that up? And how do we integrate from both angles? That's what all of this is about. We're not trying to push away or repress more material. What we're trying to do is to widen the idea of who we could be, who we could become in the future. And that's really, really difficult to begin with. That's why we need other people to be with. It might be, as I was saying, they're a friend. It might be a partner. It might be a teacher. It might be a coach. It might be a therapist. It might be a counselor. It could be a priest. It could be anybody. It could be a journal that you start to practice just writing down in that sense as well. But the idea is we need to be able to bridge the gap between the unconscious self, which is who we are already, but we just don't identify with it, the conscious self of who we think we are or who we think we could become, and then that little bridge in the middle of it all. Because all that's going to happen is, let's say you're successful in all of this, when we start to develop the confidence and everything's going well at work, and then we realize a year down the line, I want a promotion. My self-esteem is better than it was, and I feel like I'm worthy of doing this. But I can't ask for a promotion because that brings up a lot of difficulty when I think back to my childhood, and let's say money wasn't particularly good. Mum might, instead of thinking about me as arrogant and overconfident, they might start to see me as rude because you don't just ask for money. That's not the type of people that we are. So all of a sudden, we get straight back to not quite square one, but we're back down to unconscious material. Now we're not dealing with a lack of confidence or arrogance. Now we're dealing with money issues. And so we repeat the process. How do we be able to identify that in the first place? Unconscious material. What do we do in the future? What does a healthy version look like of me who is good with money? That's where toward a psychology of being comes in. And then again, how do we learn to bridge the gap? Because this is still going to feel uncomfortable. It's still going to feel unusual. That's where the primal wound comes in. And then the same thing's going to happen. I'm not going to go through a million examples for this. But the idea is, just because we get to the end of that process, it's going to be cyclical. A new problem is always going to emerge as you develop and as you evolve along certain lines. And different traits will be required of you and different characteristics will be required of you. So as a result, we need an ongoing system and process to be able to help guide us through that journey. Just to talk you through some of the notes that I made in terms of how this has helped me and like the overall view, I've just made a few notes on here. So I'm just reading directly from a laptop, which is just off screen. But for romancing the shadow, I've been using this for making the unconscious aspects of my life conscious in all areas, which is what I've been talking about. It provides ongoing questions so that you can uncover more about yourself. And there's also a chance to check your projections and address where they've actually come from. I've talked about projections elsewhere on this channel. I'm not going to introduce it as a new idea now, but very, very briefly, this idea of when I see other people, what do I immediately highlight within them? What kind of traits and characteristics and values become extremely obvious to me when I see that other person? And how can I then start to look back at myself as a result of it all? So that's how I would be using romancing the shadow. When I talk about the primal wound, when I talk about that bridge in the middle, this is for addressing your wounds, exactly as it suggests from the title itself. It calls into question your life context, your upbringing, your personality, your coping mechanisms, which is the dysfunctional side of if you don't feel like you can suddenly manage who you want to become, and coping mechanisms help you to avoid that future, then we need to call that into question as well. It helps to integrate the higher as well as the lower unconscious and also expand the middle unconscious. I'm using terms there from psychosynthesis, but they are quite useful structurally if you want to be able to understand that. And then finally, just for this last little point for toward a psychology of being, for present moment groundedness, simple ways to decide how to act, guides on how to review my progress, and as an ongoing coaching resource to help redirect me when I go off path. For a lot of the books that I've been reading, I've been making little notes in terms of if I ever forget for whatever reason what these books are about, then here's how they're going to be useful for me. I do this for the vast majority of it all, and this might be quite useful for you as well. But I'm aware that if I'm recommending a lot of books, and as good as they all are, and as helpful as they all are, you might be quite struggling for time. It's going to be these three, in my opinion, that would have the biggest impact. So if I just hold them up there as well. I'll include links in the description for all this. And if you are wondering, in terms of the actual material itself, this will be roughly 700 pages across these three books. If you dedicated a year to read those three, then it'd only be about 2 pages per day to be able to get through something like that. And again, just so we're aware, I am including within this process the idea that some of these pages, for example, will look like this, where, if I can find a good example of it, there'll be like 1 or 2 words per page. Like one of the pages in this case just says growth and cognition. That's one of your pages done already. So it's quite straightforward if we break it down across a year. Maybe across a month it might be quite difficult if you're not a reader already, but over a year, slow down, learn how to manage this process. And as I've done with a lot of this as well, as you can start to see, I've highlighted a lot of the points in here so that I can easily come back to this and flick back to it and return to it. So that's what all this is about. It's about understanding how do I first of all become a reader to be able to manage all this. From that reading, how do I then start to do the inner work? And what does the inner work itself look like? Well, it looks like identifying the unconscious, learning how to actually incorporate that into our conscious self, and then looking at that bridge in between. So there's plenty of book recommendations on this playlist, and this is where I'm going to finish this particular playlist now. But on this channel, there'll be a lot more to come in terms of psychology, philosophy, and inner work in general. But if you're wondering where to begin, those would be the 3 books that I would suggest. If you need me for anything, find me in the comment section or find me on Instagram, and please reach out to me for anything, whether it's book recommendations, whether it's somebody to talk to, or anything else in the meantime. I'm more than happy to help out.